So this would not be a fair question except for the fact that you are a composer, you're interested in history, you've been very close to her, you are a conductor and a performer on the violin. You have promoted and been involved with many great American works and composers, living and otherwise. What place does Julia Perry have in American music? How are we to think of her? What is an appropriate context? Of course, the context evolves all the time, but she had influences. She hasn't influenced people yet much because she fell into such obscurity rapidly. But how do you place her music?
Well, her work wasn't known except for the Stabat Mater, which is probably her most famous work for alto and string orchestra. But there are these little articles from when she was younger, and there was a spread in Life magazine in which she was featured because she was studying in Italy at the time, and it was an article about Americans studying in Italy. And there's a wonderful picture of her looking very intense and pensive at the same time at her writing desk. I feel that because most composers in America have struggled to publicize themselves, and there are many, many stories and biographies of how someone managed to meet the right person at the right time and to propel themselves into a successful career, and had to switch personalities to fit into many different places. Julia Perry is the opposite of that. I think that she was uncompromising to the bone in her work, in her worldview. She believed in teaching and community and communication, and she kept her own counsel. Even when she sets spirituals, even when she's writing a beautiful song like By the Sea, even when she's writing for orchestra, it seems like she simply doesn't, it never occurs to her to be like anyone else. On paper, her work looks confusing and hard to place. But when you hear it, it seems such a unique, dynamic voice. I wish I could hear her speak. I wish I could have heard her sing, because in her orchestration, when I walked into the hall last night, I thought, that's Julia Perry's voice. The way different choirs of instrument maintain their integrity and still sound. You know, you have the flutes by themselves after the horns have played. You hear violas and clarinets, or violas and piano, right? It's always very distinctive and very sharply etched. And there is, besides what I feel is an obsessive nature, there is a warmth that comes through it, almost in spite of itself. So I think it's just a remarkable body of work.
Anything else you'd like to touch on?
I hope that people will listen to the work and discover something that stands on its own. No apologies need to be made for this music by this wonderful composer.
Why do you think her career, which was meteoric at one point, I mean, she was performed by the New York Philharmonic, and she had the opportunity to conduct the Vienna Philharmonic, and I mean, at the age of late 20s, early 30s, you thought this was clearly somebody destined for a really exalted path internationally. And she came back to America. She had trouble finding work. She had trouble finding income. And it never materialized. Do you have any idea why, or is it a combination of reasons?
I suspect that, like her music, I asked a friend about Julia Perry, and she had known her. And this friend, I won't name her, who is not prone to saying too much about people unless she wants to have a good time and just party. But when she's talking about colleagues, she's very measured. And the only thing she would say was, aside from the fact that she was a friend, that she was very difficult. And if this person is saying that about Julia Perry, my guess is that Julia Perry was not someone who was interested in playing games. And
Wouldn't go along to get along.
Would go along to get along.
Yeah.
And there is, in that period of music, remember that even Copland and other male American composers felt a chill in the cultural climate because of the Cold War with Russia, and that there was a sort of a conservatism that took place in the 30s and 40s in American music and arts, and that suddenly things were folksy. And I think that I think that when the 60s happened, there was a recalibration in our cultural life that moved towards universities, and there was either the music for the masses kind of thing or the post-Webern
Highly
intellectualized music. And she is not concerned, even though a piano teacher complained that Julia Perry wrote by numbers, and that the great masters didn't do that, and that she didn't want any part of it. But I think that right by the numbers was a misunderstanding of what was going on, because there is nothing ultimately mysterious about the processes at work in Julia's music. It is sound. It's the physics of sound in your ears and in the room. And I think that she was not interested in writing pleasant melodies that coddled the listener. She wasn't interested in writing heroic music that put on a good face for something that was difficult. And certainly, I can't imagine what it would have been to be her after having so much success in Europe, where musicians and people of color are treated as people, right? Ultimately, so many African Americans simply moved to Europe because they were treated as artists, not as first African Americans. James Baldwin, Nathan Davis, the wonderful saxophone jazz musician, much preferred living in France.
We said the same with Mrs. Everett at the very first of our oral history project, and she made the same comment, and I could come up with similar examples. Black Americans finding a warm welcome, an enthusiastic welcome in Europe, who could barely be served lunch in America.
Yeah, and I think there's an interview in the Akron Beacon Journal when she was probably in her 30s and was having all this success in Europe, and the writer, I can't remember his name, it's in my files, calls her the young girl.
Oh.
The girl composer, and asks her why she identifies herself as J. Perry on programs and in her music. And she just says to him directly, I felt that if I were known to be a woman, I wouldn't be taken seriously. And so that hides the fact I'm just the composer named J. Perry. And I think that didn't end in the 40s or 50s or even
Yeah.
60s.
Right.
So,
Florence Price made the same comment. She said, I'm doubly disadvantaged. I'm black and I'm a woman. In writing, I think, to the head of the Boston Symphony at the time. But Florence Price was an engaging personality and had many, many friends and was in a neighborhood of artists that welcomed her and celebrated her. Julia Perry was a loner. Yeah. And she certainly didn't enjoy that. And she also suffered from ill health, not only the strokes, but before that she had a syndrome called acromegaly, and I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, swelling of the bones and possibly of the joints, and I imagine just life was just not easy for her. You're one of the few, Roger, you were the reason that I even heard the name for the first time. I was so embarrassed when you asked me first, this is some years ago on the phone, but do you know Julia Perry? And I said no. Well, this important figure emerged from Akron. I said, wow. And we've been on this journey ever since, and now the Symphony and all of our community are very engaged with it.
it was so wonderful to hear her sounds
Yeah.
in the hall last night.
It felt like we were engaged in a seance,
Yep.
speaking with the dead and allowing the dead to have their voice through our work.
Yeah, in this music, she lives again.
She does.
It's really wonderful.
Well, Roger, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for
We
having
can
me.
continue to speak, and I know we will, but it's important to have these comments on the record. Thank you.
Thank you.